Alright, The Donut Odyssey by Bobby Wilson. I noticed the donut shop on our first night in Kyoto. There was a market street that was closed to cars behind our inn. After our day of sightseeing, we leisurely strolled through the market to get a dose of the local flavor. There were restaurants, vegetable stands, fruit shops, clothing stores, bakeries, and even a shrine. About halfway down the street was a place that sold takoyaki and asahi. We weren't hungry, but we had made a deal. Really, I had made a deal with myself that we could have as much beer and food as we wanted on this trip, so we stopped for a post-dinner snack. The takoyaki shop only had 2 tables. We removed our shoes and warmed ourselves by the space heater. The owner brought over my beer, and I drank off half of it in one go. When the takoyaki came, they were dealt with in a similarly hasty fashion. Back on the road, glowing with the warmth from the beer and the octopus, we headed in the direction we had come. Our plan was to raid the Lawson station near the market exit for beer and a snack mix of peanuts and dried fish that we both loved. That's when I saw it, a tiny little stall, not much wider than my wingspan, with its shutters 3/4 of the way up, but its lights off. A sign outside advertised creme brulee donuts. I was instantly intrigued. Creme brulee was one of those word phrases with which I was implicitly familiar and absolutely could not define, but was also certain that it was fancy. Fancy donuts, an oxymoronic term, an incongruous pairing like filet mignon hot pockets. It seemed like a perfect product for me. The donut aspect ensured that it wouldn't be too expensive. The creme brulee elevated it past a mere plebeian comestible. I walked over to the doorless shop and stuck my head in, but there was no movement and no sound. The market road was full of people, including Limbs, who didn't want a donut at 8 p.m. Neither did I, but I did want some answers. What was a creme brulee donut? How much did it cost? Was the shop open or closed? I got no answers. Nobody came out from the back of the shop. Nobody responded to my mezza voce, hey. I was too timid to throw out a full-throated hey in an unfamiliar country, especially one as quiet as Japan. We left the donut shop behind, and I remarked that I would return tomorrow morning to grab us a couple of donuts for breakfast. Limbs responded that in addition to the peanuts and dried fish, we should also buy those little cheese snacks at Lawson Station. As a black man, I'm susceptible to being stereotyped, so I try not to traffic in stereotypes myself. And yet, I'm human and lazy, so like everyone else, I occasionally use a cultural shorthand to understand the world. It was this cultural shorthand that led me to believe that all Japanese people woke up at 5 in the morning, exercised, read, and headed to the office for a 12-hour workday. Maybe the details weren't quite as specific as that, but the basic premise was that the Japanese people were an industrious people. As such, I expected the coffee shops and bakeries to be open at 6:30 or 7 in the morning. You have probably guessed by now that the donut shop was closed when I walked past it. It wouldn't be much of an odyssey if I was able to secure the treasure on the second day of the hunt. I was only mildly annoyed with the shop for being closed, because every other business on the street was also closed. It didn't appear to be unusual. I finally found one bakery that was coming out of its slumber. I bought a couple of pastries. They didn't have coffee, and all of the coffee shops were still closed, apparently waiting to open after everyone had risen and gone to work. So I hoofed it to Lawson Station and bought coffee for me and Limbs. We headed to the Gaion district that day. Gaion has some beautiful shrines and temples. The best tourist attraction in the area, however, is the non-Japanese tourists who have paid money to stay in ryokan and be attired in traditional Japanese garb. The local word for these people is idiot. They are Prince Akeem and Simi arriving in Queens and buying I Heart New York t-shirts to blend in with the crowd. What causes this lapse in awareness when people leave their own countries? It's a sickness. The main reason we went to the Gaion district was to see a geisha at Gaion Corner. We paid for a couple of tickets and were treated to a tea ceremony. Watching a tea ceremony, that is. We weren't actually given any tea. A tea ceremony, a traditional short play, a geisha performance, and a few other cultural experiences. It was cool to see a geisha, but it was also obvious that we were seeing a subpar production. The geisha's makeup was haphazardly applied. The chairs in the theater were in a state of disrepair, and the biggest tell of all, There were no Japanese people in the audience. A few days earlier in Osaka, we had gone to the National Bunraku Theater and watched a puppet show. It was amazing. There was no question that the performers were former apprentices who had toiled for years at their craft to become highly trained masters of their vocation. The audience was almost entirely Japanese. Besides Lims and myself, there was one other foreigner in attendance. The National Bunraku Theater had headsets with English commentary, so I rented one. They didn't cater to foreigners, but as a national venue, it had international choices on hand. The geisha show, on the other hand, had the distinct feeling of a tourist trap. We were starting to notice that a lot of Kyoto felt that way. The real Kyoto seemed to be hidden away behind a veil, inaccessible to the uninitiated. As we walked the streets looking for a restaurant after taking a photo with Maiko, we saw a sushi shop that had a sign that said, "No foreigners." Perhaps they feared a language issue. Still, I couldn't imagine seeing that sign in Nanjing or Los Angeles. I think that the geisha show in Kyoto was where we started to go off script. We were suffering from shrine/temple fatigue. I've heard of a similar condition in the European traveler known as cathedral/church fatigue. The fact was we had seen enough. We decided we would focus on museums, cafes, bookstores, and markets. The next 2 days were a blur. We spent a lot of time at the Nishiki market where eating and walking is forbidden, a rule that, after living in China for 10 years in constant danger of errant skewers, I truly appreciate. We went to Maruzen bookstore where I found a copy of Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Water Dancer. We discovered a manga museum where Lim spent a very satisfactory morning reading manga. The museum sold issues of manga in English but not in Chinese, even though over half of the patrons were from China. We found a vinyl shop and toured a sake distillery and stopped at many places to eat takoyaki and drink asahi or Jim Beam highballs. Occasionally we would notice that we were still outside the veil. One of the nights that we were looking for sushi, we saw a group of suited men and women sneak into a restaurant, the entrance of which seemingly materialized out of thin air. We had no idea what food the restaurant served, or if it was good, but we wanted to go there. Neither one of us, however, was brave enough to see if we could be admitted, and even if we got in, could we afford it? It seemed better not to find out the hard way. You know what we could afford, though? Well, actually, at that point, I don't think I knew the price. But anyway, we probably could have afforded the creme brulee donut, 2 of them. I went by the shop one afternoon, a day when we had decided to drop off some purchases before further urban exploration, and I swear to God it was shuttered. This was in the middle of the day. In China, there's a midday siesta called wujiao. With zero evidence aside from the shuttered donut shop, I decided that Japan, or maybe just Kyoto, also had a siesta culture. The next time I went by the donut shop, I was drunk. We were eating snacks and drinking sake in our hotel room when we suddenly realized that we were out of snacks and sake. The situation had snuck up on us out of nowhere. I volunteered to go to Lawson Station to get us more supplies. Lims was not alarmed at my enthusiasm. She knows I love drunken wanderings. I'm sure she never suspected that I had an ulterior motive. From our hotel, it was about 200 meters to the market street. If I turned left and walked about 50 meters, there would be Lawson Station. If I turned right and walked some more, the donut shop would eventually materialize. I turned right. I passed the shrine the locals visited on their way to work. The donut shop had become my shrine. Outside the veil, geishas wore smudged makeup, and I dreamed not of sushi in Tokyo subway stations, but of forbidden gourmet donuts forever eluding my grasp. When I reached the donut shop, the shutters were not drawn. It appeared as it did that first night, the shutters down a quarter of the way like the heavy lids of one not long for waking life. The shop was at rest, its circadian rhythm designating this time for relaxation, but not sleep. I stared into the mouth of the beast, waiting for a sign that it lived, a snore, a snarl, a noise of any kind to affirm my beliefs, but none came. It was a sake night, and I had a slight buzz from the rice liquor. Asahi would have dulled my senses, or highballs my judgment, but the sake left me as crisp and clear as the January night in Kyoto, with just a bit of fuzz around the edges. As such, I didn't walk into the partially shuttered shop. I didn't yell into the mouth of the beast, like a scorned lover, the way I had thought of doing. I stood there until all the anger of my unrequited patronization slowly seeped into the night. Then I went into Lawson Station and bought a pint of Jim Beam. By the penultimate day in Kyoto, traveler's haze had set in. We had been in the city long enough to get our fill of tourism, but not long enough to get a fill of the city. We needed 3 more weeks or 1 less day, nothing in between. We roamed the streets aimlessly looking for tchotchkes for friends in Nanjing. I didn't think about the donut shop. I had given up hope. On the final day, we were to take a train to Osaka and fly from there to Nanjing. We went down the back road to Market Street, rolling suitcases in tow, and limbs turned left to get our morning coffee at Lawson Station. "No!" I yelled. Probably not that emphatically, but you get the point. I needed the donut. Limbs indulged me. We both hustled down the market road with our suitcases bobbling behind us. We weren't running because we were in danger of missing our train. We were running because it was our last chance to lay hands on the Holy Grail. When we got to the donut shop, it was closed, of course. But this time there was a sign, a literal stand-up sign. It said they opened at 9 a.m. It was the first time any such notice had been visible. I breathed a sigh of relief. The place did exist. It was not a front for the Yakuza, or a figment of my imagination. It was real. It was also 8:30. I wasn't going to wait for 30 minutes for a donut. In a way, I had been waiting for 5 days, but that had been passive waiting. This was active waiting. We had plans to go down to the Kyoto Tower area and hang out for a few hours before catching the train to Osaka. The donut was a nice idea, but its mystery had been solved. Whoever owned the shop did not adhere to my industrious stereotype. Fine. I would go to Lawson Station for coffee and pastry. Lawson Station had yet to let me down. We have Lawson stations in Nanjing, but I call them Lawson or Lawsons minus the station. They feel more like an American convenience store, not like the Japanese Lawson Station, which feels like a place where you can sit down to enjoy your coffee and light breakfast. That's just what we did that morning. We sat there drinking coffee and eating something. It wasn't a creme brulee donut, and that didn't sit right with me. I was up and I didn't have to tell Limbs where I was going. She watched me from her chair as I rushed out of Lawson Station. When I got there, the donut shop was open, awake, alive. Shutters were not visible, multiple signs were outside of the shop, and lights were on. I walked into the shop and waited. There were no other customers, and there was no clerk. He came out of the back after a few minutes. His flour-covered apron made it clear that he was also the chef. I ordered 1 regular creme brulee donut and 1 matcha creme brulee donut. Did you know that creme brulee means burned cream? I've had great donuts in my life. The first time I had a Krispy Kreme, I had 8 more during a car ride from one basketball game to the next. There was also an apple fritter saga in my youth that stretched over years and is much too long to recount here. But the creme brulee donut wasn't like that. It just wasn't that good. And I couldn't have cared less. It was a fancy donut that we ate with automated machine coffee in Lawson Station. The food wasn't traditional Japanese, but it was the right food for us in that moment. We couldn't slip behind the veil into clandestine restaurants, Japanese-only sushi joints, or authentic geisha shows. There were language barriers, and cultural barriers, and financial restrictions. We could have gotten angry about it. I'm sure that I did for a little bit. But the moment I had the donut in my hands, the anger dissipated. I didn't know a donut in a convenience store with the person you love is one of life's great experiences until it was. And now, I'll never forget it. Later at the airport, we walked around the duty-free shops looking at stuff we didn't want or need to buy. After about 5 minutes, we realized we were wasting time. We bought some airport sushi and a couple of Asahis. Okay, I drank both of them. And waited for our plane. On the television, they were showing sumo wrestling, an event I had wanted to attend but couldn't fit into our itinerary as it was in Tokyo. It didn't matter. I sat back in the plastic airport seat, drinking Asahi and watching large naked men run into each other. It couldn't have been any better, even if I had been there in person. The end. Thank you for watching.